I am Brittany Quickwarner. I'm the president and CEO of the Eugene Area Chamber of Commerce, and we're excited to have you for our Committed to Community webinar series. This is a series that we started during the pandemic as a tool to get information out to the broader business community and the community as a whole quickly while things were changing and a lot of information was coming down. We were hosting 3 of these a week for several months in 2020, and so there was a lot of really good information from experts in our community we were able to share. And there were requests to continue these types of webinars free and open to the public to help us share information about our community, about issues that the Chamber is working on, about issues that matter to individuals in our community. And so we have done that every month this year, thanks in part to Oregon Community Credit Union. They came on as our title sponsor for this webinar series, and they have been a great partner in helping us get word out to the community about the things that we think you guys need to know about. So huge shout out and appreciation to them. They're a wonderful partner for us. Today, I'm excited to have Karen Knutson. She is the executive director of Better Housing Together, which is a collaborative that was formed a handful of years ago from several community partners who saw a need to come together around our housing goals as a community to identify this kind of ways to solve this crisis of affordability and availability that we're seeing across our community. So we'll let Karen talk a little bit more about that. But before we get started, I want to let you guys know we are live on Facebook. So thank you to anyone joining us on Facebook right now. We will allow time for questions at the end of Karen's presentation and some discussion. So if you have any questions, please put those in the chat and we'll make sure to ask those to the speaker. And if you're on Facebook, feel free to comment with questions. And we have Amanda on our staff here is going to be monitoring that so she can send those back over to the Zoom chat and we can make sure to get those asked to Karen. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to you. Thanks for being here, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. It is a delight to be here today, and I looking forward to sharing some of this work and also having really a pretty lively discussion about our housing needs and the housing crisis that we're facing here in Lane County. I am Karen Knutson, and I am going to try to share my screen, though I'll need a little bit of help to do that. And just today offer you all really, some broader context to the current conversations and policy issues that we have in front of us with regards to housing. I am an architect and an urban designer. I teach in planning and architecture at the University of Oregon on the non-tenured faculty. I have my own private practice and am the founding director of Better Housing Together. And let's see here, I can now share my screen. Looks good, wonderful. And with the conversation today, I'll introduce Better Housing Together, and I'll, as I mentioned, talk about some of the history and the context and policy that's really relevant right now and ways in which it's important for our community to plug into this process. But I just want to start by saying to everyone who is listening and taking the time to think about housing and our housing crisis today, that there are some really encouraging work underway locally, reasons to believe and things to be proud of that are accomplishments and outcomes that we're seeing that are really great indicators of good work to come and of a desire within our community to see innovation and new solutions and a compassionate and thoughtful and smart and agile response to our housing crisis. So I want to be sure to say that at the beginning, because I'm also going to share some challenging context with this work, and highlight the fact that throughout any process and in any experience of community, we have choices and we make choices and we have different paths that we can choose to go down continuously. The community that we inhabit is the product of many decisions and paths and choices of previous generations. And it's important for us to think about where we are and what we are contributing to those future opportunities and future generations that will be in this place. So speaking of this place and this work, Better Housing Together, as Brittany mentioned, we are an independent 501c3 a housing advocacy organization, but we are also delighted to be the backbone of a collective impact effort that includes 50 partners throughout Lane County that have come together to commit to this mission that we can work collaboratively to increase housing affordability, diversity, and supply in our community. And that thinking of those three things together, housing affordability and diversity and supply, is the way that we can get at solving our housing crisis and all of the repercussions and harms that go along with that, from the experience of homelessness to lower graduation rates, to food insecurity, to lack of access to good medical care. So many of the challenges we face in community, and try to solve in other ways, track back to the fact that we have a lot of housing unstable and unstable households, and a lot of people who are really struggling while working very, very hard to make things work. So we are really proud to be a multi-sector and community-based organization. And it's exciting to think about what we've been able to accomplish in just a couple of years of work. Now, when talking about our community in Lane County, in anywhere in the country, it's actually pretty easy to find us, right? If you're distant from the West Coast and talking about Lane County, people might not know where you are, unless you have a map like this that shows you the percentage of households who are cost burdened by their housing. And there we are, Lane County, with that nice bright red, easily identifiable county shape and location that shows that more than 40% of our community is cost burdened by their housing. That means spending more than 30% of their income on their housing costs alone. And further, that we have a significant number of households in our community who are severely cost burdened by their housing, which means they're paying more than 50% of their income just to meet their housing costs. Looking at our challenge in another perspective, again, there we are, easy to find, the average price income to price ratio by metro area. And what this information looks at is, how many years of income at in an occupation group or at an average wage does a person need to be able to afford housing in a location? And that nice bright dot indicating our price to income ratio being very high. In a healthy housing market with lots of opportunity, access, and stability, you might see this ratio down, somewhere between 3, 4, pushing up into 5 starts to be really quite difficult for most people. In our community, and some of you may be doing the math right now, take your annual income and multiply it by a number of years that it would take to purchase a house, and you pretty quickly see that we're talking about 6 and 7s and 8. And completed in a lot of cases with our local wages. That also connects back to the experience that so many people in our community are having. And it's important, as we're talking about housing need, to remember that affordability is a product of the wages that people have access to and the housing supply that is available to them in a community. This simple diagram from the National Low Income Housing Coalition shows that for a 2-bedroom apartment in Oregon, you need to be earning about $23 an hour. Spoiler, $23 an hour is not what most people in Oregon are earning with their wages. And that locally, what that translates to is a person working at minimum wage, 71 hours a week, every week, just to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. The other component of connecting housing price to our market and wages and other actions is thinking about what we are supplying. And just a really quick graph to show the number of housing permits per 100 new residents and sort of a 5-year rolling average, and that we've been underbuilding relative to our community's needs and population changes on average since 2010. So heading past a decade towards a 15-year milestone of not meeting the supply that we already know that we need to accommodate. So in response to this context, and this is some, that like reason to believe and to see progress is possible. A couple of years ago in 2019, the Oregon State Legislature passed, what is a milestone, historic legislation around re-legalizing middle housing types. And I'll talk more about what that means, but this was an effort that Better Housing Together was a part of that included very broad range of local and statewide organizations, all of whom are working to address our housing crisis from their perspectives and thinking about the systemic challenges that we have in our community. And what came out as a result of this work, as mentioned, is basically changes in our land use requirements that will allow a broader range of traditional housing types to once again be built on the majority of our residential lands. So missing middle housing, this term like begs the question, like, so what's been missing from our housing? And certainly there are a lot of things that are missing, but specifically relative to missing middle housing, what is that talking about? Well, the things it's talking about are these 4 bullets. So missing middle housing, it tends to be mid-size, right? Smaller units, which suit a different price point or income, cost, and as well as lifestyle in terms of household or demographic. Mid-cost, so housing supply that has been focused on meeting the needs of the workforce in the middle of the market, that has also been missing. Housing that is not for midlife, right? So housing that's not for a married couple with 2.3 children, but to actually take into account just how much our demographics have shifted and how much housing need there is beyond that sort of fixed view of the single unit home within the American landscape. And then lastly, livability. So thinking about walkable neighborhoods as being a priority that both very large younger generations and a very large older generation is seeking. Access to transit being incredibly important to both affordability and access for daily needs, and being able to walk and be nearby amenities, right? Parks, schools, community life, and commercial components that are a part of fun. So to show you all another way of thinking about missing middle housing, because we're going to talk about it relative to the Oregon state law and our local customization of this law and what it means for people here who are dreaming about the home that they might have access to and the stability that that might offer. This diagram across the bottom of this slide was drawn by Dan Perolik, who we worked to bring to Eugene for a couple of events in 2017 and was really part of the initial launch of Better Housing Together's work in this community. But Dan Perolik coined the term missing middle housing, and really just what he was seeking to make easily explainable is that there are all of these types of housing that we used to build like pre-mid 20th century that are between the single family detached home or the single unit home and like a mid-rise apartment. There's this whole gradient of housing types. And when you go to older cities, certainly than ours, or older cities than Eugene, Springfield, cities outside of the United States, you see this housing and these residential types everywhere. And they're an incredibly important part of a community's resilience. It's long-term sort of placemaking and culture, and to having a diversity of housing that matches the diversity of people within a place, within a community. The Oregon state laws and our local code focusing on missing middle housing is really looking at the lower end of that missing middle gradient. It's talking about duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, cottage clusters, and townhomes, and is sort of like all of the smaller types that are incredibly similar in character and size to existing single family homes and single unit homes. So what this new law passed in 2019 meant was that there would be a couple of years of work that's been quite intensive on all levels, from state to local, and back and forth. But what it would mean for large cities like Eugene that have a population of more than 25,000 people is that duplexes, as well as triplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, and cottage clusters would be allowed on all the parcels that are currently zoned for single family residential. So re-legalizing housing types, and you can see these couple of examples that used to be very common, and we can find them still even sprinkled around within Eugene, but allowing a path for those housing types to exist again. So before I go any further and talking about current events, I promised we would talk a little bit about history and how we got to here and why this work is so important. So first, we're going to go back and talk a little bit about Victorian London. And for maybe there are some experts in Victorian history who are attending us today, but the context for you to have in thinking about the late 19th century is that our experience of housing, and when I say our, I'm speaking to the experience of housing within London and that European model, which came to the United States, and with a lot of back and forth between the UK, Northern Europe, and the United States in terms of our country's structure and colonial occupation and development or utilization of this landscape. But that in Victorian London, the housing was really not that different from experiences that were within medieval times, right? Like there are not utilities serving this housing. The day begins with dawn and ends with sunset. Candlelight, might be accessible. And that there were significant challenges and social problems with overcrowding, illness, disease, lack of opportunity that were a huge problem and that were visible within the city. And what grew out of that were some ideas, some theories, right? And some paths in thinking about urban design and city planning and what it would mean to create a more idealized condition of the city. So Ebenezer Howard's theory around garden cities being a direct connection back to that condition and lack of opportunity that was so apparent within London and within other cities. And taking that context and that problem and saying, well, let's imagine it being different, and let's create this sort of idealized, not to scale diagram of what it would look like to organize our city, to locate, a central zone and to assign every different use to its location, to, design it as a certain acreage with a certain amount of associated agricultural land and a certain size of population. I mentioned that Victorian history because jumping across the pond to the late 19th century, 100 years later in New York, and these are photographs by the photojournalist Jacob Riis, who published the book, How the Other Half Lives. There's a direct connection to that history and to the progressive era housing reform in the United States at that turn of the century. What Jacob Riis' photographs did was allow and really inspire and catalyze a broad community conversation about needs that were not visible to people who were not experiencing them, that were not seen as being serious or harmful, because they were just completely separate from the lifestyle that people living in homes with a servant class supporting them and access to emergent utilities and all sorts of supportive social structures. They were completely insulated and separate from this world. And what you saw coming out of that was another version of idealization of how we might instead organize our communities. So this is Clarence Perry's diagram of the neighborhood unit from 1929. And what's important about this diagram, and I think important in all of our community conversation, is to remember that the realizing of outcomes is not the problem. We don't need to stop imagining like how things could be improved upon or what the best condition might be for organizing within community, but to always be tracking that as a part of a larger process, and it's something that transforms over time and may take us to places that we don't actually intend to land. So in the case of the neighborhood unit, the simple idea here was that there would again be a sort of preferable amount of acreage assigned to this unit of neighborhood. At the center of that neighborhood unit would be, institutional uses like a community center, a church, gathering, communal program at the center, that there would be park space assigned, and that there would be interior streets that were very, clearly oriented towards pedestrian uses. And that what's really important to understand or see from this diagram is that all of the traffic would be pushed to the periphery and to the edge condition, which if you're thinking about just one cell, just one neighborhood, seems like could be an interesting idea. If you're starting to think about the connectivity among neighborhoods, or if you're starting to think about this cell propagated many, 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 many times, you can start to imagine where some of the challenges come in. Two other critical pieces of information to have in mind as we're thinking about this idealization of community. And this image on the left is the Radburn town plan, which was a way of taking, these not to scale and conceptual diagrams of what a new way of planning neighborhoods might be like, and locating them in space on actual, on topography and addressing this actual spatial constraints of that space. But that this work of idealizing neighborhoods was not happening in a vacuum. And that at the same time in our country, we were having a very explicit conversation about who was expected to be a part of these neighborhoods, how we were planning or actively planning to not include people within neighborhoods, and the redlining maps from Holk's residential security maps from 1939. This is the image from Portland, is a very clear expression of that. Oftentimes when I'm talking with students and start to lay out some of the context and sort of field position of our challenges in community, you can see faces start to fall as people think like, oh, we did it wrong. The policies don't work. We're not getting what we wanted. And it's really important to always remember that their policies do work. And in the cases of things like the redlining maps leading into mid-20th century, this was a policy designed to assign financial resources to certain neighbors and neighborhoods, white neighborhoods, and that Black communities and poor non-white neighborhoods were determined to be dangerous and not good investments for additional capital or funding, and that was a policy, right? And it was very effective in delivering the outcome that was sought by it, which was to prioritize certain neighbors and communities based primarily on race, but also some on their income, and direct all the resources to those needs, and really ignore and in some cases completely dehumanize others within that community. So our policies work. We just need to really scrutinize what they're actually designed to be doing. Broadacre City, Frank Lloyd Wright, many people like architects, Frank Lloyd Wright, yes, American giant. This was yet another view of modernism and thinking about what an idealized city landscape might look like. It's sort of super suburban in its utilization of land and occupation of landscape with community uses. And very quickly, the reason for showing you all these is that all of this information adds up into a pattern that we now know as our more suburban development pattern. This is Levittown, seminal example of early suburban development pattern from 1939, which really was just saying, like, let's take a single unit home, let's locate them on lots, let's design the infrastructure to allow access to these lots, but really place the responsibility for transportation to daily needs onto that individual housing unit. Let's not be that concerned about how connected these housing units are to one another or how much connectivity exists within these neighborhoods. But let's just create this vision of an American dream. It's one idealized condition, and this had a huge push behind it through the middle of the 20th century. 1956 and the creation of our interstate highway system added yet another reinforcement to that idea, right, of pushing all the traffic high speed into sort of big troughs or canyons, and then thinking about a pattern of residential use within that that is really focused on one idealization of what the American family and the American home might be like. And what we know now in looking at this history is that, the single family residence, it's not disappearing. This is the fabric of, more than 90% of our land for residential uses. This is like the very field within which we are now working. So it's not going away. But what we have learned is that there is a lot that was not accounted for. And a lot of different types of households and needs that were not accounted for in emphasizing just that solution. So this photograph I love because it's a bit of a reminder of how this conversation about middle housing is kind of a back to the future solution. This is a two flat in Milwaukee, the Milwaukee two flat, called a two flat because there are two housing units within this little home. And the reason I love this photograph by Christopher Hilliard is because I always have imagined that, this group of 6 people standing on the stairs close together, like maybe that is the family unit that's occupying the primary residence of this house. And maybe this gentleman over there on the left is their boarder, right? Their renter who is living in the second flat of this home, is extended family or friend of a friend, but is someone who needed access to housing, and that relationship between that person who needed housing, the provision of a housing type that is fundamentally resilient, right, and adaptable and flexible, and the dreams of this family, recently immigrated to the United States, that those could all be bundled together in a self-supporting structure. This is a type, of course, that across certain cities, we saw entire neighborhoods, right, built out with duplexes because of their naturally resilient and adaptable structure. So as we're thinking about all of that history and where we are now, it naturally begs the questions of like, okay, so how can this middle housing help the current context we have? We're not in 1875 and we're not in Milwaukee. Like, what's our situation here in Eugene? Our situation here in Eugene is that the relegalization of these housing types is significant, and it is transformational in terms of thinking about the kinds of opportunities that we are allowing for within our community. This is a photograph on the right from 12th Avenue in Eugene of a duplex, right? Looks like a single unit home, but has, is a very familiar version of this type with a single entrance off of a large porch that leads to a hard right into the unit on the ground floor and a stair slipping up upstairs. Other things to be thinking about in terms of how this middle housing can help is to remember that we need to be planning for our future needs. House Bill 2001 and some of the laws related to that are the focus of today's conversation, but there's another law that was passed, House Bill 2003, that is a requirement for communities to do housing needs assessments. And when you look back over the last several decades, so here's 4 of them, it's pretty easy to see that we've been building about 3/4 of our housing stock as single family homes and about 1/4, maybe a little bit less, as multifamily, right? Apartment buildings primarily. And that we have a lot more diversity of community need and household types than are reflected in that mix. And we've known that for a long time. To put a finer point on this, this is the housing affordability framework that we composed as a part of the Lane County Affordable Housing Action Plan. This is our county's first adopted action plan to address our housing crisis. And what this framework shows across these 4 colored bars, and try to find yourself within this mix, is a collection in that top bar of annual incomes relative to occupational groups within our community. So, not a person who starts life as a preschool teacher and then becomes a veterinarian, but the occupational group of preschool teacher, right? Because early education tends to be an occupation group within which people stay in, or medical technician tends to be an occupation that people stay in, is the truth, many times beyond some of our service industry and retail employment. But that in looking at these different occupational groups, understand what is the average annual wage that a person working with that field has access to locally, and very quickly translating that into the orange bar of what affordable monthly housing costs would be, right? Remembering that cost burden percentage, and that we're looking for a housing cost that is less than 30% or less of a person's total monthly income. That gray bar quickly connects this to the median family income for a 3-person household. And these are percentage thresholds that correspond to different funding types or different ways that we categorize capital A, capital H affordable housing in comparison to market rate housing. And then lastly, in that green bar, affordable home ownership costs and an estimated monthly mortgage. Now, you all probably know that actual mortgages are influenced by all sorts of different characteristics and conditions that the individual seeking that loan bring into that, and also the perspective and the work of the lending agency. But you can quickly see, like, okay, so where does that monthly affordable homeownership cost land? And if we took a really simple cost per square foot, what might that mean in terms of the size of home that would be affordable for a person earning this average occupational group income to live in, right? Like, what do we need to actually be building to bring our housing supply closer into alignment with our community's capacity? This is super important that we're thinking about all the time, right? Like, not just funding and financing strategies, but the supply and production strategies, because 75% of the occupations in Lane County earn less than 100% AMI. 75% of the occupation groups in our community earn less than 100% of the area median income. That means there are a lot of people here who are earning an amount of money that requires us to be innovative in thinking about our housing supply. When you connect this information in this affordable housing framework to that middle housing diagram that Dan Perulik built, things to notice is that, like, well, how will this help? Well, I just lost you all for a second. But things to look at and not to miss is that currently the supply of our housing options and new housing coming onto our market are way off, the top end of incomes, right? Like new supply into our market, the majority of new housing built within the last 5 years is at 450,000 and above. That was a statistic from the City of Eugene's economic analysis about a year and a half ago. And so when thinking about the influence of middle housing, and specifically, right, those smaller units that are a part of this House Bill 2001, we are delighted to report the economic analysis looking at the influence of this policy change is that the new supply coming onto the market could actually reach, if we do a good job with our design of this zoning and new land use regulations, that this new supply could be at 71 to 94% of AMI, right? This is middle, median incomes, occupation groups within our community. This is a radically different opportunity than what currently exists within our housing supply, and incredibly exciting for a piece of policy to at least create the opportunity for that kind of influence and outcome to be accomplished. What does this look like? Like, what happens, when all of this comes to pass? This is a diagram that we built just a couple of months ago to share, what middle housing looks like within community. And what it looks like within community is like other housing that is in that same community. So you can have an existing single unit home, an existing garage, and that can look, in terms of its massing and scale, utilization of site, just like a new single family home built on that site with a garage ADU on the back of that property, right? Structurally, spatially, like these are almost indistinguishable from one another. You can also have a stacked duplex occupy that same envelope with a detached ADU in the backyard, or an existing side-by-side duplex with a detached ADU in the backyard, or a 4-unit quad or townhome configuration. And the point of illustrating this diagram is that these types of houses have always been a part of our American, architectural history and neighborhood development. But it just so happens that in Eugene and the age that we are and that we grew up through, we don't have as many of them as would be helpful for the composition of community that we are today. Many much smaller households and many people seeking more efficient housing options. Speaking to efficiency, there is a huge benefit in connecting our housing policy to any pollution and climate policy actions, right? Smaller homes are more efficient. They cost less to maintain. They cost less to heat and cool. They produce less pollution. Their operating costs, which are 80, or energy used in operations, both of those things, 80%, right, of the energy a home uses comes from its operations over time, not from its construction or demolition. And some great analysis by Sightline built off of some reports from Oregon DEQ that just show how much influence having more small and attached homes can have against our climate goals. More housing within our existing urban lands and this slow incremental change over time. This is also a way for us to better utilize the land that we have, right? And to increase the mix of housing that's available within our neighborhoods and smaller homes. So, this diagram and the shift from the left, to the right, this might be, a process of, goodness, 2 generations, right? To see that amount of change. Think about places that you visited and how slowly our built environment changes. But significant when you think about the costs of all of the infrastructure that serve this block and this location, and the fact that those costs continue always over time, and sharing those costs among more households makes certainly good fiscal sense for communities. More diverse housing also and finally, on this point, is a way for us to have more equity within our community. More affordable housing options for people within our community is absolutely key. Housing discrimination is real. It affects people, families for generations, and it is not something that ended with the Fair Housing Act in 1968. The reason that we put together this infographic, which is vertical, so broken onto these 2 pages, is just to help people understand the influence of the lack of access to home ownership and how that cascades across generations, and the specific harms and specific loss of opportunity within our Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. Within our experience as a community, there are people who have had limited access and no access and been underserved for generations. And there's a history of the ways in which we have done that underserving, right? We have excluded people from opportunity. We have restricted opportunity. We did it explicitly in the founding of this state, but we also reinforced that discriminatory practice through covenants until they were struck down by the Supreme Court. And then, of course, moved into mid-century and redlining programs. And, even beyond the civil rights era, still, very explicit means of discriminating based on income, land use and exclusionary zoning, right? Things that Fair Housing Act doesn't specifically address. I have definitely talked with people in the community who have thought but really, I really did think that those, mid-century civil rights era efforts solved this problem. And now it's just a matter of us doing the work. And the fact is that when you look at the data and that you look at the amount of homeownership and the amount of wealth that white or BIPOC households hold, it's pretty clear. It's like 8 to 10 times what a white median family wealth is relative to a Black household's median family wealth. And that home ownership rates have really not shifted over time, right? Very little change since mid-century. And that is because we have not done anything to expand the ladder of housing opportunity, right? As some of these programs have gone into place to address discrimination, we haven't done anything to address how we are operating in terms of production and housing opportunity. And that is why eliminating exclusionary zoning and expanding and increasing the supply of affordable housing options within a community are at the top of every series of recommendations or reports coming from organizations focused on racial justice and justice in housing outcomes, because they know and see, as we can see, that our landscape is not set up. The field isn't set up for people to have the opportunity that we wish, right, and that we imagine being available. So how's Eugene, Springfield doing? How are we to take steps to spur middle housing? We're not actually to the spurring point of this process. That's a whole other challenge that we'll face after we have a regulatory framework in place. But Eugene has done a really remarkable job of laying out an engagement process to inform the development of a draft code proposal, which is now out for public input. And this engagement process, I won't talk about everything that's in this diagram that the city prepared to try and summarize it on one page, but there are hundreds and hundreds of hours by different stakeholder groups and equity panels and roundtable groups. 741 people responded to an extensive survey asking a lot of questions about where we should land with this housing policy as we're customizing this collection of state requirements. And what came out of that is that as the city was fundamentally asking, do we just allow this housing? Should we encourage it, and try to remove more barriers that would lead to more outcomes? Or do we actively incentivize this effort and really put our shoulder to it and try to do more to remove barriers? 82% of those 741 people, the majority of whom were homeowners, right? Digging in a little bit to this data, the majority of people offering feedback, white and older homeowners, when looking at the respondents to that survey, 82% asking our community to do more, right? Asking us not to just barely stumble across the finish line, but to encourage and incentivize outcomes that better align the housing that we are providing with the needs that our community has. In Springfield, as a comparison to this, I think Eugene and Springfield have, so often nurtured identities, about being, very, very distinct and very different communities. But we are a part of one metro housing market. And when Springfield asked these questions, of its residents, should we allow or encourage, or in their case, maximize the middle housing outcomes, what they found was that 70% of the respondents of their survey, which was even more skewed towards homeowners and white neighbors within our community, 70% asking to do more and to encourage and incentivize outcomes. This information is also completely consistent with a poll that we were able to complete in February of 2021, polling 500 adult self-identified voters about housing needs, perceptions of housing issues, what they might see as trade-offs or as productive. And what we heard from that is that 8 out of 10 people favor the new Oregon law and the new middle housing policy. And they absolutely see that our zoning needs to change because working families, young people, our elders as well, right? Seniors and low-income households are struggling to access housing, and it's creating a lot of instability, right? 3/4, 75 and 78% of owners and renters saying that buying housing and renting housing, it's all way too expensive. And this is very near the top, right? In the top 3 issues that people within our community think affect quality of life. And they are right. The United Way's data will back this up every time. We've also sent out our own outreach into the community to share the results from that survey. This was a mailing that Better Housing Together was able to do in spring of 2021, right? Like we're not able to meet in large groups and gather. So we thought, okay, we'll get some letters out in the mail and we'll give people a postcard. And they can spend, 50 cents on a stamp and write their name or write other notes and send back, direction to our city council and mayor or what their dreams are about middle housing and these opportunities. 573 of these postcards were sent back to our city council and mayor, people taking the time to tear out a postcard in a mailing that they get, from a local housing nonprofit, saying like, here's a time that we can, offer feedback and give input to a process. 573 people taking the time to do that. So naturally begs the question, like, where do I come in, right? Or where do you come in? That's the question that I hope that you all are asking yourselves by this point. One of the places that you can come in is in just a couple of weeks, right? It's Halloween this weekend, and then suddenly we're in November. On November 16th at 5:30 p.m., our Planning Commission will be holding a public hearing on middle housing. If you are concerned about access to housing, about the affordability of housing, about setting your roots down here, about accomplishing the dreams that you or your family have, and seeing a role that a broader range of housing option plays in that, any of those issues and others, please consider attending this meeting, joining and testifying at this public hearing. It's incredibly important that our elected leadership and appointed leadership in the Planning Commission and the City Council hear from people in the community who are experiencing the pressure and harms of the current housing context that we have. You can also email any of your feedback or wishes or asks to a single email address, which is middlehousingtestimony@eugene-or.gov. Which is essentially a clearinghouse, and all emails that go to that address go to Planning Commission and City Council. So it's another way to get your voice heard. Things that Better Housing Together is talking about as we are identifying, ways that we can specifically support housing and support better outcomes with this customization of our middle housing law locally. The biggest one is to prioritize options, right, and flexibility, and to think about the reduction or elimination of minimum parking requirements, allowing detached units, right, of these different types, and allowing for smaller lots. All of those are actions that will create more opportunity for housing to be the outcome, and for more affordable housing to be the outcome from this legislation. Deeper affordability, the second point that we talk a lot about, is a way of thinking about how we might include capital A, capital H, affordable housing with new supply. And one strategy that other communities have tried and that we think would be beneficial here is to include a development bonus. of 2 units when those units are provided at 80% area median income or below. This is a way to stitch into the fabric of our communities and into new supply of housing, affordable housing that otherwise, is very difficult to accomplish. And we can talk more about development pro formas and envelopes if people are curious. And then lastly, waiving SDCs and supporting ADUs, accessory dwelling units. We can further incentivize new production and new affordable supply by doing those things. The types of middle housing that we are most likely to see when these new regulations are in effect are going to be like very gradual and small infill. The actual market studies of other cities that have policies like this in place are showing that, one, you have to remove minimum parking requirements if you are serious about having housing outcomes and not having those obstruct housing outcomes. And two, that the first generation or 2 generations of housing that result from this type of change in our laws is going to be small and gradual infill. I wanted to also insert at this point that if you're reading our newspapers or receiving emails, there also are some false messages that are out there. Certainly middle housing being the end of the world is one, or that it's going to mean the destruction of our community is not true. This housing already exists within our community. Many people live within it and love it. It's not a harmful outcome. But the other things that have been sort of thrown at the wall to see if they'll stick are arguments like the public has been ignored. Eugene's process has been expansive. The public has not been ignored. It's the broadest engagement of our community that we've ever accomplished with the planning process. Middle housing is for greedy developers. It's actually not for greedy developers. It's for people who need housing, and the whole continuum of our development community, from affordable housing developers to nonprofits working to solve homelessness, to market rate developers. Homeowners, right, will probably be the primary developer of new middle housing. It's not going to be about greed. There are going to be other motivations because it's hard to do this work. Middle housing is only for renters, not true. SB 458, which was passed in 2021, is a new lot division law that will allow the middle housing that's created to be ownership housing, right? Partitioned for sale. Middle housing won't be affordable. It will be a heck of a lot more affordable than what we're doing now. And there are other things that we can do with our policy, if this is really a point of emphasis, and Better Housing Together thinks it is, to make sure that we have paths that guarantee affordability when that is something that is possible, right? Middle housing won't solve homelessness. It will not solve homelessness, but it will contribute what it can to solving homelessness. We have a whole continuum of needs within our housing crisis, and middle housing primarily is about addressing 60% AMI to maybe 120% of AMI, right? Clearly a very middle supply, long-term intervention. Homelessness could be addressed through middle housing, right? There are solutions that will be possible as a result of this law that aren't currently possible within our regulatory structure. But homelessness will not be solved by middle housing alone, and that's okay because we have other work to do. Middle housing will increase displacement. This is a message that is particularly frustrating to me because it is so disingenuous, and the research is so clear that displacement and gentrification, if those are your concerns, then addressing the lack of supply of new affordable housing and not, right, taking efforts to actually deliver more housing supply that meets your community needs, that is what generates displacement within a community, right? The absence of affordable alternatives, and that there's no housing available when people actually need to change housing, right? Nothing that people can afford. You talk a lot more about that.
Corinne, we have about 9 minutes, so just a time check.
Oh, goodness, thank you. This will be the last couple of things. Lastly, just a strange thing, because there's, some stuff that comes up that's just unusual, a concern that, people won't be able to have at-home electric vehicle charging stations if we don't have minimum parking requirements. And there are lots of solutions to electric vehicle charging. And lots of innovations in terms of our infrastructure, and also millions of electric vehicles that are charged around the world without having ownership of a single family home to do so. If you're interested in more information about why we need middle housing, we also created a movie to talk about this, and we would be happy if you would share it. It's available on our Facebook page, and we will try to push it out through a couple of other avenues. But I'm going to stop there with this anything else exciting question, because I think the most exciting thing that I'd like to hear is what you all are thinking about. And I'm happy to flag some other things that are on deck in our community and exciting too.
Awesome. So we have a couple minutes left. We want to get some questions in. If you guys have any questions for Karin, please put those in the chat or in the question and answer. Either one works. And we will try to get as many answered very quickly. We're going to have a brief as
rapid fire
session. And then those who have more questions, please let us know and we'll get Karin to help answer those and send them back out to folks. So Jared Barlow asks, how will Lane County allow for middle housing where there's no land available to build these duplex, triplex, or multifamily homes? Will they expand the growth boundaries for House Bill 2001 to be able to implement?
So my quick answer to this is that the middle housing work is, very separate from our ongoing growth management and urban reserve planning (UGB) processes. The key, I think, Jared, to your question is to learn about Senate Bill 458 and this partitioning process, which is designed to allow for new middle housing development on existing lots. Right, our minimum lot size will be compatible, right, to the production of these new homes. And that is a path for existing residential land to be used.
Yeah, so we have some availability in our own urban growth boundary already if we're going to limit the size those lots are allowed to be, which is where we're at right now. We have to limit those sizes so then more houses can be built on those. But again, like Karin said, this is something that will change over decades, not over a few years. And so I think people get nervous when they think there's going to be a bunch more houses built in my neighborhood. That's not really how the market drives that development.
Yeah. More likely, Jared, you would see something like an existing, say 12,000 square foot lot, right? We have many of those, or even, 10,000 or 8,000 square foot lot, and see a subdivision of that lot or the building of a new house on that lot that would be permitted through this process.
Kiana asks if we can get your contact information. She works for Lane County Medical Society and wants to share some information with them. And yes, we will make sure that you guys get that.
Absolutely.
Ethan asks, what does the missing middle housing types, I assume, offer that denser apartments or condos don't?
Oh, great question. So they offer an increment, right, between those larger and denser apartments and single unit housing, right? Their construction, right, is a process that is much more similar to the delivery of a single unit home than it is to a large apartment building. Their construction system is likely, light frame, very simple. This is important because we have a building industry that we can mobilize to create these solutions. And it's not only like big answers, right, with big problems, but that actually it's a finer grain collection of solutions. And it's just flexibility, right? Like this housing can be on lots that are much smaller, would be incompatible spatially or geometrically with a larger building, and a path to, a small front door, right? A cottage unit, as opposed to, an apartment that you're renting long-term and never building equity in a larger building. Relative to condos, like the big difference is that we have a lot of laws on the books in Oregon that make delivering condos really difficult. The liability laws are very challenging, and it's one of the reasons we don't see more of them. And this is just a separate path.
Linda says, if I own a duplex and I don't want to be a landlord, will it be possible to have it sold as 2 small units? Will the city be allowing this in the future?
Yes, and this is the with some conditions met, of course, right? But this is where that Senate Bill 458 that was just passed in 2021 is going to be especially of interest to you, Linda. And duplexes will be the most straightforward of the middle housing types in terms of the lot requirements that they have to deal with. The things that you'll want to be thinking about, but if it's already duplex, this is likely addressed, is any separation issues structurally between the units if you're wanting to sell them, and then just going through the process of partitioning.
That's great. Someone says, have our cities done something to eliminate racial segregation in housing areas? Are realtors punished for doing this?
Oh goodness, there's a lot in this question.
Yeah.
So number one is that this legislation to re-legalize traditional housing types broadly across all neighborhoods, right? And not just saying more housing can exist some places, but not over here and not over there, but doing that in a way that is equitable, right? And creates more opportunity across all of the neighborhoods in our community is one piece of addressing some of the discriminatory history within our housing policies. The other piece, and there's other pieces to this, but I love this reminder from a meeting that I was in the other day, that when your concerns are around, thinking about gentrification and displacement and equity, right? But addressing those issues with policy, you need to be thinking about production and preservation and protection, 3 Ps, right? If your concerns are seriously about displacement, right? And there's some, I think, great work that the city of Eugene is just starting on an anti-displacement policy that gets more specific and real and serious about these issues and how to address them.
All right, it looks like we don't have any more questions in the queue here. So with a couple minutes left, I really want to try to summarize as best as I can sort of what we have in front of us and what people can actually do to help. So House Bill 2001 was passed by our state legislators that basically said to cities, you need to go in and fix your housing codes to allow for missing middle housing types in the places where you currently only allow for single family homes. And the state said you have to do that. Wasn't we get to decide yes or no, this is what the state said. So now our community, as we're going in to change those codes, we get to say, do we want to just do the bare minimum to get as few of those types of new missing middle housing pieces that we want? Or do we want to go above and beyond to actually incentivize this new missing middle type, or this reinvigoration, I shouldn't say, not new, it's already existing, missing middle type of housing, to actually make it easier and more affordable to build this type of housing, which is then more affordable to our community. And so right now, what the city needs to hear from our community members is, are you supportive of us trying to actually encourage and incentivize this missing middle type of housing as a way to help solve our housing crisis? And so we're dealing with the code right now, which is kind of wonky and has a lot of opportunity for people to just kind of like space out and not really pay attention to that part of the conversation. But unless the code works, we can never then find out who's going to come and build that type of housing, because they won't even come and do it. So we have to get the code right. And that's where it's important for the community to weigh in and say, yes, make the code so we can build as much of this missing middle housing as possible, and do it in a way that preserves and protects our neighborhoods. Obviously, that's something that we want to make sure it fits within the culture of our neighborhoods. However, we need to be a little bit more open to having more neighbors living in and around our spaces so we can accommodate their housing needs. So that's the opportunity we have as a community, is to actually weigh in and tell our elected officials, yes, do everything you can to make housing more affordable for people in our community. So the first step in that is the public hearing in front of the Planning Commission. Then the Planning Commission will make recommendations to the City Council, and the City Council will have an opportunity again for the public to weigh in and tell them how they think about this. So there's a several month process, but really it's kind of starting now and it's going to happen quickly. And we need people to be engaged in that conversation. So thank you, Karen, so much for helping folks kind of understand the history of this and how relevant it is to everybody today. And if you're here today and you want more information and you want to, maybe you need a little bit more sort of like context to feel comfortable testifying, reach out to us, because we want to help provide you whatever you need to feel comfortable using your voice in the community, which is exactly what we need right now with this conversation and around housing. So reach out to us. Please reach out to me. Karen just put her email in the chat. And I wanted to give the last minute over to, if he's still here, I think Daniel Riplinger from OCCU has joined us. Daniel, I'm going to turn your mic on in case you're here. I just wanted to say hi and thank you and give you an opportunity to kind of wrap us up as the sponsor.
Well, yeah, no, thank you so much, Brittany. And yes, I just wanted to say that we're super happy to continue to sponsor the Committed to Community webinar series. And thank you, Karen, so much for being here today and sharing your knowledge and expertise on this very important topic.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel, for you guys and your support too. All right, we will have this recording up on our website. So if you guys want to share this with anyone who you think might want to watch this, please do. And Cara and I will work together on a follow-up email with some of the information that she provided, so you guys can have some of that at your fingertips. But we really appreciate you taking the time. And for those of you who joined us a second time to make sure we got the information and the speaker here and right, we appreciate you as well. And hopefully you'll join us for our next Committed to Community webinar. I believe we're going to be digging into the issue of homelessness a little bit more deeply and tying the dots, connecting the dots, if you will, between these issues. So we look forward to seeing you guys next month. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Oh, thank you, Brittany. That was great. And I saw I had the Q&A open on my screen, but not the chat open. I was like, oh no, oh no, oh no.